going to talk about and make a commentary on one of my essays, my recent Medium essay called Jordan Peterson, Sex and the Patriarchy. So Jordan Peterson is criticized and attacked for equating, let's say, the feminine principle or femininity with chaos, right? And the masculine or masculinity as order. This may seem chauvinistic to people in our post-feminist age, even if there's nothing particularly wrong with chaos in itself. Peterson knows that women have been symbolically associated with positive qualities as well, of course, like soul, psyche, wisdom, energy, beauty, compassion, etc. So I'd like to offer a remedy to this conceptual confusion, to this difficulty. So if we say that the male principle is consciousness, then what if we say that the female principle is being? So what the hell do I mean by this? Well, being is everything that is, that exists, that is alive, that is embodied. Being is the world of form. This helps us to give equal symbolic weight and gravity to the masculine and feminine. Consciousness and being arise together. They are complementary. The masculine and feminine are complementary. They should have equal power symbolically. And they always have traditionally, I will argue. So symbolically, consciousness is always higher. It's in the head, right? But higher doesn't always have to be greater or better. The belly in the Chinese systems of the Dan Qian is, symbolically speaking, where being is. It's in the belly. Your being is in your belly, so to speak. Your anchor for life. So the earth, therefore, is in the belly, and the feminine is always associated with the earth. So where do the masculine and the feminine meet? They meet in the heart. They meet between consciousness and being in that central location, which is always in the heart. So everybody has a head, and everybody has a belly. Everybody has consciousness and being. Everybody has masculine and feminine qualities. In a man, the masculine qualities are usually dominant, obviously, right? Whereas in a woman, the feminine is usually dominant. Not always. There are some men who have very powerful feminine qualities. And there's some women who have obviously very strong masculine qualities. So nobody is, in an absolute sense, fully male or female, right? Except in the most superficial way, right? A man has a penis, therefore he's a man. A woman has a vagina, therefore she's a woman. But we're not talking about exterior plumbing. We're talking about essential qualities, archetypal qualities. And one of the problems with, let's say, postmodernism is that it doesn't acknowledge these qualities. It doesn't acknowledge these differences. It wants to flatten out all hierarchies to make this sort of sameness. So yes, there's a spectrum, I would say. There's a spectrum of male and female, obviously. And that's fine. But that doesn't mean that male and female, masculine and feminine, literally and symbolically do not exist. That would be absurd. So Peterson also gets criticized for being somewhat of a patriarch, right? For equating masculinity with this higher principle and femininity with this lower principle. And I suppose you could understand why feminists would be upset by this. But let's look at it in a different way. So the patriarchy, in the most, let's say, politicized manner, has been co-opted to mean, right, that there's this sort of world where men are dominant and treat women as chattel, and that it's been like that through history. And in 1960 there was this amazing liberation, and which continues today. However, I'd say that's a political, narrow, ideological use and understanding of the word patriarchy. The patriarchy this word has become a misnomer. And it denigrates, actually, women. It denigrates the secret powers that women have always had. Even if social and political, rights are a rather recent development for women. Masculine power is not all bad, right? Just as feminine power is not all sweetness and light. So we need to understand the benefits, the positive qualities of masculinity and femininity, as well as their shadow aspects, as well as their deeper, darker aspects. And we also have to understand the historical development of the father lineage of the patriarchy and the matriarchy, the maternal lineage. The maternal lineage from, let's say, mother to daughter, and the patrilineal lineage from father to son. So it's not that controversial to say that in the West, right, we have repressed the feminine archetypes throughout history, and we have infantilized and idealized women and done a lot worse. However, what's more difficult to say, and is a much more subtle point, and it's especially difficult to say in the age of Me Too, is that ironically, Western patriarchy, which means a world that is dominated, right, by figures, masculine figures in science, religion, and philosophy, this has also allowed for the conditions for some kind of emancipation of women to be possible. So this is a controversial statement, of course, but the patriarchy has also contributed to women's liberation and made possible social emancipation of women to a certain extent. You just have to look at birth control to get this point. So don't get me wrong here. I'm not denying the historical oppression of women, right? And I'm all for equal opportunity. However, we have to acknowledge a positive male consciousness that has always existed, just as negative women archetypes have always existed. In India, you have this image of Kali. Somehow the Christian West seems to have tried to, let's say, sanitize the feminine archetype, make it benevolent and soft, and all of these, let's say, cliche feminine traits like softness, but there's also a wrathful aspect to femininity, which is not that acknowledged, for good reason, because it's perhaps rather terrifying. Newman calls it the devouring mother. So you have the devouring mother and you have the tyrannical father. These are the negative masculine feminine archetypes. according to Newman, Jung, Freud, Peterson. It's well documented in the psychoanalytic literature, I believe. So male aggression and violence, toxic masculinity, right? Even that is nothing negative. It can be channeled in the right direction, like in the martial arts. If we didn't have this forceful male, quality, which has to do with rationality, which has to do with a certain kind of cutting through, which is vertical, which is phallic, which is strong, and which can exist in women, I might add. If we didn't have that, we wouldn't get very far. Maybe history would never have begun, so to speak. So all this to say, the victim oppressive narrative is just part of the story. There's always been co-creation, goodwill between men and women. And the world we live in today, where women are freer than ever, is a result of both male and female sacrifice. Both, obviously. I mean, how many men died trying to protect women and children in wars? Men have always been responsible for protecting, exposing themselves to violence and death, right? Just as women have always have been the more vulnerable population. And so was it a higher or lesser number who died in childbirth, of women who were raped in war, etc.? These terrible things that have happened to women, or men who were slaughtered. You can play the numbers game and try to decide who was more oppressed than the other. But what we do know is that a great amount of sacrifice and a vast mountain of bodies is our historical, what we've inherited from history, let's say. Sacrifice is a word that people don't like in the modern world, because everything is about rights and privileges and entitlement rather than responsibility. This to me is a genius of Jordan Peterson, is he's bringing this notion of responsibility and back into the culture. And this has incredible importance as far as I'm concerned. And it's the right critique of our culture, or where we're at right now. Anyway, the matriarchy. So some people have been saying that, prehistorical societies were mostly matriarchal, and there's some debate about that. We do know that there were mother cults in the ancient world. And we do know that traditional societies were much more mother-oriented than modern societies. We have the Venus of Willendorf, which is this sort of feminine, the first idol that they found, the religious art of the feminine, which is this massive woman who represents fertility. In any case, life begins, psychologically speaking, with the mother, with the matriarchy. So for a child, the mother is primary, the father is secondary. So women are religiously, or biologically speaking, first principle. Religiously speaking, in the Orthodox tradition, they talk about women being the mother of God, or they talk about the mother of God. So mother is etymologically close to matter. That's why we speak of Mother Earth or matter. The patriarchy has always been about consciousness thrusting, going upwards. The sky cult. Okay, moving beyond nature into time. The patriarchy is the birth of the nightmare of history, but also transcendence. Consciousness is about transcendence, where you could say being is about presence, perhaps, another way to look at it. The matriarchy is about cycles, tides, things that the flowing aspect of reality, whereas the patriarchy is this cutting through. Matriarchy is multiplicity, pantheism. It's the earth cult, whereas the patriarchy is the sky cult, the one God cult, monotheism. So the revival of paganism is the revival of the earth cult. And it's a necessary, I would say, a necessary counterbalance to monotheism. So Camille Paglia writes about this very well, about the development of culture being this sort of conflict between the Apollonian and the Dionysian, the earth cult and the sky cult. Both are sort of always there, right? There's always this paganism in culture. Even in the Catholic Church, a lot of the paganist ritual has never been overcome, right? So let's say both are necessary, the sky cult and the earth cult. Both are, still very present in our culture. And there's a tension between them. There's a play between them. There's a battle between them. The Taoists call love a flowery battle. I love that term. It's between yin and yang, energy and emptiness. All the dualities, form consciousness, consciousness being, activity, stillness, light and dark, nature and civilization, man and woman, all these opposites, which are working with each other creatively. And this can be symbolized by the sexual act, right? This creative tension between the masculine and feminine, which comes together and creates a child. Maybe there'll always be this sort of gulf between the sexes, this abyss, this riddle that can't be solved. I don't think this postmodern attempt to flatten out all gender differences is positive, or will it be successful. And in the biological realm, which is very much related to the psychological realm, there's not a difference between your mind and your body. It's connected. It's one thing. There'll always be differences. So we should. Again, I think in this, we need to integrate. We need not to equate this sort of idea of equality with sameness, right? We're different. It's no problem. Polarization will always exist, and it's a good thing. There'll always be a subtle and dynamic dance between, the male and the female. Sometimes it's a love dance. Sometimes it's a war dance. So are men and women the same, or are they different? There's a Zen phrase which might help us navigate this gender issue. So in Zen they say reality is not one and not two. In gender terms, this means you can't say that men and women are one thing, because there's obvious differences. But you can't also say that they're completely different, because they share common ground. There's most things about us are similar, right? The size of our brain, But there are differences. So the truth is somewhere, in between. Men and women exist in Not a relation of power and dominance, but in a relation of, or at least ideally, in a symmetrical relationship, not a hierarchical relationship. It's the opposite sex, right? Not the greater or lesser sex. Men and women are opposite to each other, symbolically. It's interesting that in some biblical traditions, the first man, Adam, is androgynous. He's plural in Genesis, apparently, which means he's both male and female. And theologically, God, separated male and female. Maybe the first Adam was lonely. In any case, he put them in the Garden of Eden, and they fucked that up. There was a fall from paradise, which means that man has to work, and women bleed and have menstrual cycles and raise children. This is our situation, and symbolically, it's about the birth of consciousness and being. Or let's say consciousness coming into being. Men and women are always incomplete. They're always looking for, we're always incomplete. There's something always in us that is desiring union. We want so much to come together with our opposite. And we feel we feel the most unified, usually most people, perhaps yogis or saints or people who are in this condition of union permanently, or it's different, but for most of us ordinary schmucks, the moments, in sexual union is the moment when we, when we can taste this sort of Edenic experience. Carl Jung wrote about this a lot. He talked about how there's this, when the split in the original androgynous being occurred, the anima and the animus developed. And the anima is the hidden female in a man, and the animus is the hidden man in every female. And a person possessed by the anima is possessed by the unconscious female. A man possessed by the anima is possessed by the unconscious female. Whereas a woman possessed by the animus is possessed by an unconscious male. An extremely feminine man, maybe possessed by a female spirit, you could say, and an extremely, aggressive, competitive, testosterone-addled female is maybe possessed by the anima. And I'm not talking good or bad or saying this is, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with this spectrum. I'm not making moral judgments here. But and this does explain perhaps the transgender phenomenon, right? A man who identifies with his anima, he might feel more like a woman than a man, right? He might want to change into a woman. He might identify much more with a woman than a man. Okay, just to summarize, and this is more or less Neumann's thesis, and others who have noticed this, and who think about archetypes. We could say that history begins with matriarchy, right? It rises up into patriarchy, and then it returns to, let's say, an integration of the two, which is perhaps beyond a hegemony of patriarchy or matriarchy. So we're living in the society that has met much of its patriarchal trappings, but we're also in the process of discovering and integrating this lost matriarchal world. It's a difficult process and a terrifying one. And I would say that we're living in the age of reconciliation of the matriarchy and the patriarchy. And there's a certain amount of conflict between the two, obviously. So the matriarchy, the environmental movement, which is much about reintegration of nature in a hypermasculine society. This is the matriarchy, psychologically speaking, that is. The matriarchy teaches us about subsistence and enduring communities. Pre-modern societies, which did have child sacrifice and virgin sacrifice and human sacrifice and a lot of things that we wouldn't want today. One of the advantages of them was that they endured, right? They endured for millions of years without any particular change. They lived in a state of balance. And they lived in a state of reciprocity with the earth. So perhaps this is the positive sense of reintegrating the matriarchy and what we have to do, even if we do not want to romanticize this societies. And the dark side might be a return to tribalism. So these cultures can teach us about reciprocity in a world where we're on the verge of ecological collapse. So the embrace of the feminine in the postmodern world is, I would say, and perhaps this is where I differ slightly than Peterson, it's a necessary and positive stage, even if it does have its deep shadows, which Peterson describes very well, in my opinion. So the concept of uniting the masculine and the feminine, of these two being in balance is very present in traditional societies. In the Native Americans have this idea of the Mother Earth and the Great Spirit, and that's the matriarchy and the patriarchy, perhaps. Consciousness and being, perhaps. So our modern patriarchy has been more about the expansion and the development of masculine consciousness and the ego individual. This is beautifully outlined in Neumann's book, The Origin and History of Consciousness. And Neumann believed that, all this depth psychology and psychoanalysis and, everything we see, all the discoveries of the 20th century are related to, many of them are related to the need to look back to these ancient origins and reintegrate this repressed mother cult. Jung thought that Christianity was unstable because it was the Christian Trinity was unstable because it was a Trinity, whereas a stable society would be a quaternity, which would have, you could say masculine, feminine, or you could say the father, son, the mother, daughter, and that would be a more balanced culture. On the other hand, history, consciousness, this patriarchal society is breaking through this, stasis of just nature existing on its own without any kind of change, evolution. So in the postmodern world, the weakening of the patriarchy, everybody wants to bring down the patriarchy, right? And then this celebration of all the deeper feminine archetypes. It's a bit naive, right? Because we should be careful to understand that the matriarchy is not only benevolent. It's not all sweetness and light. There's a lot of dangers in tribalism. And so we don't want a pure matriarchy. And we don't want tribalism. We don't want this, archaic world. And we don't want a pure patriarchy. Both those things on their own constitute an imbalance. The darkness of the matriarchy can be seen in, for example, castration cults, which existed everywhere in the pre-modern world. Again, I got this in Neumann. And we can see, I like to make the observation that in the Me Too movement, you have the psychological manifestation of these castration cults, where men are toxic, and there's this rape culture, and there's this idea that we need to replace the man, right? And that female hegemony is what we want. But it's not power that we should be looking for, right? It's not female hegemony or male hegemony. It's that we can work together. It's balance and harmony of these two, aspects of our nature. A while ago, I wrote this essay called Fifth Wave Feminism, which was a little bit tongue-in-cheek. It was a little bit polemic. But it suggested that women focus less on victimology and more on their strengths as women. And that we do need to, integrate the positive aspects of the matriarchy, the mother cult, the matrilineal lineage, with its positive values of community and subsistence. But also, we need to celebrate male virility and creativity. That this is important, right? And if we're just celebrating female wisdom and compassion and softness and community values and all that, if we want to throw the patriarchy, out the window, we're just gonna create more and more boring culture wars and wars of the sexes. So the feminists, I believe, need to acknowledge the shadow of femininity, just as males need to acknowledge their own, dangerous aspects of masculinity, because masculinity is obviously quite dangerous. And we need to be conscious of both poles, rather than have an unconscious patriarchy or an unconscious matriarchy. That the matriarchy needs to become conscious, and the patriarchy needs to become conscious, and the two need to come together and transcend themselves, so to speak. That's sort of my vision. And that's the vision of waking up from what James Joyce called the nightmare of history. And the nightmare of history is this separation, is this primal separation of man and women. That's what the fall is, right? It's this intense separatism. So we have to make the father lineage and the mother lineage conscious and go beyond this adolescent whining stage of victimology. That's what I think anyway. So thanks for listening. I do have a Patreon page, and please like and subscribe if you found this of any interest. And thank you very much for listening.